folks. Thanks so much for joining our Monday Mindshare again. And what an awesome weekend over there in Chamonix, watching the UTMB, and what a year for the US runners all around the world, watching as they saw their athletes in both the male and the females come in top of the podium and actually multiple spots on the podium. It's just a thrill to watch that, as much as we see athletes right across the weekend finish the awesome races there in Chamonix. And last weekend was also just awesome in Finland, watching the 70.3 Worlds. And the racing continues. One of the things we see, of course, in these large blocks leading into these A races for athletes is potentially, and in many cases, catabolic states where there is a breaking down of the tissue because of the heavy loads leading into, you know, the pointy end of the season on these critical A races. And we know that in certain catabolic states, if it's left to go too far, of course, you can lose strength in the terms of muscle tissue wasting. And then secondly, of course, begin to affect even immune function, even structural connectivity. So we're going to get into this. We're going to talk about the aspects that matter, and we actually want to maintain catabolic states, particularly for tissues like fatty tissue, but we also want to make sure that we can continue maintaining balance between catabolic states and anabolic states. So I'm going to share the screen now, and we're going to jump into some of this content. And I think you're going to find it really interesting. It's not what you always think it to be when you start looking at some of the research. And it's, as usual, what we find is it's less about just the nutrition, but it's getting the timing right with the right nutrition that really matters. So let's jump into it. Now, firstly, let's just make it simple in the spirit of catabolism, which we're talking about here, this, you know, state of a metabolic activity where we're concerned about this breakdown of complex molecules like proteins and fats. And the body is doing that essentially to release energy to stay up with the high demands that are placed on it. Or it could be through a deficit of calories that are coming into the body to support the demand. And we absolutely see that in endurance sport. And it's a balancing act, like we're showing down the bottom here. On the left-hand side, you can have the catabolic state, of course, whereby, you know, fats are being utilized as a way to fuel the body, which is a good thing. And we want that to continue. We want to support that. In fact, we want to encourage that and increase that. But of course, we don't want to see a case where we get into a deficit whereby the carbohydrate and the fat is insufficient. And there we start seeing the oxidation, the breaking down of muscle tissue to support energy. Now, on the right side, of course, you have the opposite, which is anabolic state. And for endurance athletes, of course, it's not so much about building up bulk. And in fact, just the raw aerobic, you know, typically zone 2 type training does not have such an anabolic effect. But of course, depending upon diet and just the nature of our training programs, we can see that. And we want to keep a balance here in terms of, we absolutely want to foster growth of muscle tissue to support the exercise specificity that we're focused on, which is endurance sport. But we certainly don't want to have, whether it's diet or stress or other factors that can promote the laying down of adipose fatty tissue and growth. So there is this kind of balance we're looking for. And really what we're shooting for is this anti-catabolic effect on muscle. At the same time, we want a balanced anabolic effect with respect to maintaining muscle tissue. And there are factors, of course, with just, firstly, the obvious one is just caloric balance, to make sure that we're having enough intake of, you know, complex macronutrients, whether that's fats or carbohydrates or protein. And we know that if we imbalance our insulin too much through simplified carbohydrates, that we, you know, over-exacerbate the insulinogenic effect, and we lay down fat, we blunten lipolysis, the breakdown of fat. That's not a good thing for endurance athletes. Today, we're going to talk about ketones, There'll be a second part that we talk about specifically protein. And we have already done a video on glutamine, and I'll put that as a link up here in the, I hope I'm pointing in the right direction for that particular video. You can go and check that out later. And then obviously exercise itself in the right balance has an anti-catabolic effect. It stimulates both hormonally, neurologically, and obviously the connective tissue to lay down muscle tissue and to keep balance there. Of course, in overuse or even abuse of the body in the context of overtraining, we'll find that particularly too much zone 2, you can find there can absolutely be a catabolic effect in the way of muscle wasting. And honestly, you can see this at times really in the professional ranks of athletes, and you'll see that very heavy load training blocks can, if you will, reprogram their body in terms of the makeup, but it doesn't have to, and it doesn't at all, if you will, be immune to just the professional ranks. We see this in also the age groupers. And let's dive into now how we can avoid it. And specifically for this part 1 series, I want to talk about ketones. A lot of interest, of course, in using it. We've used it for years in the Revival product of the SFuels portfolio, and we'll talk about why it sits there as we go through this these research pieces. So firstly, we're going to talk about going backwards to almost 40, 50 years ago, where some of the early studies were showing the effect of ketones. And this was an infusion. So this is, think of this as like an IV drip, if you will, where they're infusing ketone into the blood and looking at what happens to protein catabolism, the breaking down of proteins. And what they found is the data in this study, even back then, was suggesting that this heightened or this hyperketonemia may be a factor in decreasing the availability of circulating alanine, which is an amino acid, and the reduction in protein catabolism, which is characteristic of prolonged fasting. So this is some of the earlier data that came up, and then there was subsequent data a little, maybe 10 years later. And this is a study actually that really we looked at as we thought about a roadmap for product that would support endurance athletes in the context of recovery from endurance exercise and offsetting the potential oxidation of muscle tissue. And we know this happens. And this particular study was just showing that particularly with leucine oxidation as a marker for seeing muscle tissue being broken down through exercise, they were showing that by the use of BHB or ketones, that you could offset this oxidation of leucine and improve the promote, if you will, the protein synthesis in human beings. So this was interesting to us as we looked at this. This is, now still, 30, 40 years ago that this study was made available. More recently, we've also seen how ketones, when used in high inflammatory situations, and of course, endurance exercise, if you haven't noticed, is quite inflammatory, but they induced an inflammatory situation in this particular study. And they looked at, if you did that with ketones, what would happen to, if you will, the breakdown of protein that typically you would see because of some of the stress hormones and even the breakdown in the gut and the release of inflammatory cytokines like LPS, which is just, one of many, if you will, inflammatory triggers in a systemic context, not just in the gut, but as it gets into the blood through the gut barrier, it can create inflammation through the body. And that, of course, can trigger some of this muscle and protein breakdown, if you will. And you can see on the right side here, just, if you will, a summation quote. During this inflammation, ketones had this, anti-catabolic action in the muscle and even at a whole body level, which I think the reference there is also to the gut tissue, but reducing this protein breakdown and overriding, if you will, the inhibition of the synthesis of protein, which is really, really important. So these were some of the studies that is quite interesting, and it's been generally well acknowledged now that ketones have this, if you will, anti-catabolic effect on protecting and preserving protein in the face of stress, whether that is, physical stress, i.e. exercise, immune, inflammatory stress, and if you will, the catabolic threats to the muscle tissue, to the protein tissue. Ketones can offset that. It's well published, well acknowledged. Now, let's think about ketones in respect as, remembering that as before we talk about endogenously taking in ketones as a nutrient, let's just look at how this happens in the body naturally. How does it come about, ketones be produced? Well, firstly, in an energy deficient state or a deficit state, the body will begin to use, we have carbohydrates that by liver and the muscles can support, 2 or 3 hours, and through physical exercise, you can use most of that up. But the body, of course, has this massive pool of fatty tissue and fat cells that can be released. The lipolysis, or the breaking down of that fatty tissue, can release these fatty acids into the blood supply, and that can provide absolutely fuel and to the muscles through the liver, can be converted into various glucose fuels, if you will. Fatty acids themselves generally less used by the brain. They can be a little, but not much. It's not a preferred fuel by the brain. So there's multiple reasons why people believe that is, or science would suggest why it's not the case. But those fatty acids, of course, if you continue to reduce the carbohydrate load and the body senses that low carbohydrate or glycogen availability in the liver, in the muscles, those fatty acids will also come through the liver, and the liver will begin to generate these ketones. And those ketones are both a fuel to predominantly brain and heart, and to some degree, not nothing, and it's still material, to the muscle tissue. Now, there's another aspect, though, of these ketones in terms of functional role in the body. It's not just that they're a fuel themselves, but they're actually a signaling molecule, and the signaling is around being anti-catabolic. And we just spoke about the function of ketones as it protects muscle and protein tissue from being broken down, but it's also a signal that when the body, the brain particularly, senses that there is a heightened ketone level, there's receptors on on fat tissue, adipose cells. Those receptors will recognize that ketones has arrived, and that receptor will trigger the downregulation, in fact, to some degree, an inhibition or a blunting of lipolysis, the breakdown of fat. And why is this the case? Remembering that the whole body physiology, the reason why this is happening, this production of ketones, is the interpretation of the body, is that the body is going into some type of starvation situation. And in that starvation situation, the body is saying, okay, I first need to break down the fat. I need to release that fat just to keep fuel available since my carbohydrate stores are low. I then need to start producing ketones to feed my brain. But then I don't want this over runaway train on breaking down the fat so that I rapidly absorb all the fatty tissue. I want to slow that down so that I have a long potential runway in terms of access to the fuel I have in my body. So that's, that's the natural point at which ketones are produced, and ketones have this slowing down of the metabolism, breaking down the fat, so you have a longer runway. And that obviously makes sense in the context of a starvation situation, a true starvation situation. Think multi-day fast, a week-long fast. Your metabolism will come down to, if you will, give you that extended runway. Well, the function of that, of course, in endurance sport, it's not so much a starvation situation. You absolutely have a catabolic state where you are breaking down fats to produce energy. But we know in the case of, say, an Ironman, 10, 12 hours later, at the finish line, you have plenty of options from the point of view of refeeding the body. In an ultra marathon, even 100-miler, if you're at the back of the pace of the pack at UTMB, it's 40 hours, 42 hours. There's plenty of aid stations in the middle that you can take on plenty of food, and obviously at the finish line. So it's not, again, really still a starvation situation. So this does have bearing on the thinking about how we use ketones. And I'll show you some more studies that really talk a little bit more about this kind of regulatory effect of blunting lipolysis, the breaking down of fat, which really for an endurance athlete, it's questionable whether you want that. You really do want to promote and encourage fatty tissue breakdown lipolysis to release the fatty acids as a key fuel in both training and racing. Again, you can go back to 50 years and begin to see animal and test tube studies looking at this association between ketones, or BHB, and even the other form of ketones, acetoacetate, inhibiting the activation of lipase. Lipase is the enzyme that facilitates this lipolysis, this breaking down of the fatty tissue. And again, this is 40, 50 years ago that we're starting to recognize this association. Back then, it really wasn't understood what the cause was, or what the mechanism was on how this was happening. But this study began to show how BHB was actually working on some of the receptor sites on the adipose cell, on the fat cell, and the receptor site, once it realized that ketones was in the blood, or if you will, in the body, and rising in levels, that it had this negative feedback mechanism to effectively prevent an runaway metabolism on breaking down fat stores, because it wanted to sustain a longer runway for having access to those fats, and therefore it inhibited, or blunted this lipolysis function. And that was 2005. Well, last year in 2022, there was a really interesting meta-analysis that looked at, quite a lot of studies and particular cases, like hundreds of cases using BHB ketones, and understanding particularly its effect around lowering blood glucose. And this is a very interesting aspect of the use of ketones, monoesters and ketone salts. And there's different studies to suggest which is having different effects, probably more lending itself to the esters. But even the salts in this study, it was showing, as it relates specifically to impacting blood glucose lowering effect, the salts were also effective. But remember that the way that we reduce blood glucose, one of the mechanisms of the body, of course, is to stimulate insulin or improve insulin sensitivity, and thereby the glucose is removed out of the blood supply into the cells because of that insulin effect. There's a second way that also we see, if you will, this blood glucose lowering effect, And that is, again, through the inhibition of lipolysis, or the blunting of the breakdown of fatty acids. That also is a mechanism. And this study called this out, that, there's three kind of quotes here on the right-hand side, just calling out how across these trials, there was shown to be an increase in insulin concentrations following the use of exogenous ketones. But not all trials showed this. And we know that certainly in people that have a pancreas that is still healthy and the beta cells, which are the cells in the pancreas that can produce the insulin, is still healthy and functional, that there was an increase in insulin secretion. But like I said, not every trial in this meta-analysis, when I looked across all the different studies, was showing this. And that's why some of the other studies, it was suggested that maybe it's more about the fact that the ketones had this blunting effect on lipolysis that had this lowering blood glucose effect. So I think this is not a bad thing. This is just understanding how this particular nutrient works at different times. And this is a really important point, because like carbohydrates or like fats, and now we're finding like ketones, when you take it, and a lot of these studies, it's taken in a fasted state before the training intervention or the test intervention is conducted, and it's a fasted state. And that's, obviously what that means in a fasted state, and what it means if you're 2 hours into a ride could be a very different situation. So we need to understand this. And just again, this glucose lowering effect may be very interesting, of course, for type 2 diabetic, etc. So there is a very real function for ketones. But when we come back to endurance sport, let's just think about the timing. And this gets back to what SFuels has been talking about for some time, and why we've been so strong on putting it on the map. And that is this whole right fuel, right time concept, that whether we're talking about carbohydrate, or we're talking about fats, or we're talking now about ketones, that concept of using these nutrients at the right time is really important. And I think as we think about specifically an anti-catabolic effect, there is a right time to use ketones. If we're thinking about, as we go into a training session or into a race particularly, there is, I think, a right time, and maybe it's a questionable time to when to use ketones. I think our recommendation would be, as it relates to an anti-catabolic effect, which is on the right-hand side, is a post-workout or post-training, where it just makes sense that all of those effects that ketones provide, as does protein and glutamine, and just caloric load, is really valuable to offset, if you will, the breaking down of muscle tissue, to maintain muscle tissue post these endurance, whether it's, I say, training or racing endeavors that we conduct. Now, if there is this very real effect of lowering blood glucose, raising insulin levels, and blunting lipolysis, it wouldn't make much sense to go into a workout or to go into a race having done that. On the contrary, what we actually want to do is minimize insulin responses going into a race, that we have actually a primed fat oxidation efficiency ready for the race. That doesn't mean that as we get into the race, and the GLUT4 transporters, which allow glucose to come out of the blood into the cells, fueling the muscles during the race or during the training session, that happens with muscle contraction. So 20, 30 minutes into the race, or 60 minutes into the race, if you're not so intense athlete, the muscle contractions will allow those channels to open up, and for carbohydrate, glucose to come out of the blood and into the cells. Well, similarly for ketones, as we get into a race, there may be absolutely a great substrate to add on top of, the substrates that we use at SFuels, whether that is the glutamate itself, whether that is the medium chain triglycerides, the MCTs, or whether it is carbohydrate. So our recommendation would be focus on it after, as a post-workout, post-race anti-catabolic nutrient. Makes a ton of sense. All the studies suggest that it absolutely has this preservation effect on protein and muscle tissue. I would recommend at SFuels that we would advise probably not to take it prior to race, prior to workout. And increasingly, we're seeing studies come out about its role during racing. And I think there's more studies to come on that to really understand the optimal way to use ketones. And I'm sure we'll find out more on that in the future. Part 2 of this series is going to come out next week, and we're going to focus on protein and how to think about that, again, in the spirit of the anti-catabolic effect of protein. And also, similar to ketones, there's a time to take it, and there's a time where it could have the opposite effect that you're looking for. Hope you found that interesting, folks. All the best in your racing and training, and as usual, go longer. Thanks so much for joining us.